Oke.
And sorry, maybe you can explain that with the slowly English.
Sorry.
With the slowly English.
Oh yeah. Good.
But the absorbing the information.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's fine. Yeah.
Mau dimulai sekarang? Langsung aja. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi, good morning ladies and gentlemen. Saya dari punya informasi, kalau yang penting adalah informasi apa yang kalian. Jadi today's webinar is International Relation and Hegemony Policy. My name is Mariam, and I will be moderating next 2 hours. Okay, today is the second day we have Professor Award giving the presentation. Ada sebagian yang friends. And yesterday discussion was about errors in politics, and attended by postgraduate student. And today we get some student coming, but I don't even know how students we are presenting and 50 students are nanti saya teman-teman juga kalau punya pertanyaan sesuatu yang mungkin ditanyakan silahkan, nggak harus bahasa Inggris, nanti kita akan coba translation-nya. Dan teman-teman bisa raise your hand, yang dia bisa kan pertanyaan dan apa yang ditanyakan. Okay, before we start the discussion, let me introduce our guest speaker today. Professor Howard Ward.
Yeah.
Beliau adalah Ketua Departemen Politik and Public Administration University of Limerick, Republic of Ireland. Jadi ada yang tahu Ireland dia di mana? Oh, Inggris. Oke. Mana? Karirnya positifnya atau selanjutnya? And beliau memulai sebagai lecturer itu dari tahun 2003. Jadi sekarang berarti sudah sekitar sampai. Kemudian PhD beliau adalah tentang constructing hegemony. Jadi memang tema kali ini adalah tema yang sangat sesuai dengan apa yang beliau tulis ya sebelumnya. Kemudian kalau melihat dari Eh, Kemudian kalau kita lihat dari artikelnya, ya, di sini artikelnya eh, kalau penelitian recent kita ada tentang global economy, international relation, hegemony, the politics of resistance, and the new land and party. Kemudian tentang politik and regionalism, development and post-communist Rusia. Kemudian ada beberapa peran akademik yang sekali kalau kita lihat listnya. Kemudian terakhir adalah publikasi juga begitu ada beberapa. Jadi sebenarnya seminar kali ini adalah mengangkat kembali tentang buku beliau yang tentang by thinking hegemony. Jadi di situ banyak sekali penjelasan yang bisa diserap oleh teman-teman ya tentang hegemony yang di-introduce in 2013. Kemudian sebagai penting kalau kita jumpai juga banyak sekali di sini ada books, kemudian and mostly is what explain about human. And kalau melihatkan hegemony, so apa kira apa yang dominasi? Yeah, okay. I think there's one thing about hegemony and even politic in the term refer to some superpower in the international system. And maybe we thinking about post development country in US and some countries significantly to global activities. The human is achieved through vision of economic, military, and cultural. Jadi ada kombinasi ya, kita lihat dari ini ada ekonomi, militer. This is because in Indonesia we part of the middle of dan di mana ini? Oke, liberalism and hegemony is the basic thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what is the model of hegemony and what is the impact of political hegemony on country? Maybe that is the subject outline the hegemony. Okay, sorry.
No problem. Hi, everyone. Morning. This is what I'm going to try to do today is explain the term hegemony or hegemony. I'm going to talk about it, why it's important in international relations, why it's been a central concept in international relations, and some of the problems with the term, because people use the term in different ways. You've often seen the term in international relations being used in contrasting ways. Some use it as an idea, ideological. Some use it as a basis of just looking at powerful states or powerful objects. So hegemony can mean all sorts of things. It means different things in different subjects, different studies, and things like that. So this is a talk which is based on a book that I wrote about 10 years. It's still quite relevant, despite a lot has happened 10 years ago. There hasn't been a significant shift, despite strange presidents have got into the White House in America. There hasn't been a strange shift necessarily in the power dynamics in the last 10 years, closing up of things. So this was the book I wrote, which was called Rethinking Hegemony, which is it's a sort of introductory or critical introductory text to understanding hegemony, and it's in a series which is written by this publisher Macmillan, Palgrave Macmillan, which lots of things are discussed within that series. There's lots of talk, so there's rethinking the third world, rethinking globalizations, rethinking economic, rethinking the Soviet Union, rethinking regionalism, rethinking the Cold War. So there's all these sort of concepts which are written in this. So this is the books within it. And as I say, it's because the term hegemony is so central to international relations, this has become an important factor, if you like, an important topic. So this is what I'm going to try to do today, is rethink it, I suppose. So firstly, I suppose the main point is that hegemony is a central concept within international relations. It's one of the key international relations concepts, and one of the key theories, if you like, or mechanics within the way international relations operates, and the way it demonstrates, the way it formulates itself. Just wait for the slide to.
Oh, okay. Next, please. Next, please.
Sorry. Yeah. So it's often used in a neutral manner, and this is probably one of the problems with it. It's often claimed it's not value laden. Hegemony is often something that is discussed when people talk about it. Oh, the hegemony of this or hegemony of that, American hegemony, neoliberal hegemony, referring to capitalism, masculinist hegemony, hegemonic masculinity, referring to sort of the dominance of masculinism. So it's often seen as a term more than anything else. Can you pick the next one off? But the actual point is, it's a highly contested term, so it means different things to different people, and it's very difficult to actually get a proper definition, because people use it based on they come from, what political background they come from, what they're trying to say with it, and what they mean more than anything else. So it's often it's not often explained in depth. It's often a term. It's used in retrospect. People talk about hegemony. They talk about it, everywhere. It's as if it's just a noun at some point. And I'm going to try and unravel some of the understandings here of the term. Can you go to the next slide, if that's all right? So I just keep pressing them now, because if you just keep pressing the next, that's right. I think there's another, that's right. So how is it contested? What does it mean? How does it mean different things? So hegemony can mean the leadership or the dominance of the state. Now that means different things anyway, because to me a dominant state means something one way. It means that a state is dominating another state, but it's also seen as being a leader. So leadership means something slightly different. If you are leading rather than being dominant, then you're generally seen as being passive. You're being nicer. You're not being as occupying. So it can mean as two things. It often refers to two different things. So, for example, in this, I suppose in East Asia, when they talk about Chinese hegemony, for example, Chinese dominance, Chinese leadership, they mean different things, but they're often used the same. Secondly, hegemony is often seen as an ideology. It means the hegemony of something. Particularly, this is seen within capitalism and within the sort of type of capitalist system that we understand the world to be at the moment, which is sort of a form of neoliberal free market capitalism. People talk about the hegemony of that, particularly in things like sociology, communications, etc. They consistent geography. They consistently talk about neoliberal or capitalist hegemony. So that's another factor that stems from an idea, a dominant idea, a persuasive idea. But what it really means in international relations, and this is what often isn't discussed, is it really is a hybrid between the two. If we're going to actually understand what it means, we have to sort of look at how the two, how they got going, how they meant different things to different people, and what the answers to. If we really need to use a concept, we need to actually come out with something that is clear and understandable and can be used in a variety of different ways. Okay. That's a silly board game. Don't know where that is. Can you move on to the next slide? If that's okay. And sorry, the next one. Yeah. So this brings us, if you like, to the book that I wrote, and the idea of what what hegemony is. And what I try to do in this book, and this is what I'm trying to argue throughout any discussion on the term hegemony, is I look at the origins of where the term came from. And I'll discuss this in the next few slides, where the term actually came from. It's a funny name, where do we actually get this? Where do we get this term from? How does it formulate itself? How do we understand it? Secondly, we have to look at how it's been applied. There's different ways of how it's been applied, and we need to look at different understand how it's been applied. And this is what I try and do throughout this book. Also, we have to look at realities of hegemony. How do we understand hegemony? What is, if you like, hegemonic? Where does a hegemonic relationship exist and where it doesn't? And where is it applied? And I suppose what I try and come out with at the end of this is whether there may be a more nuanced concept. So what I mean by nuance is a more rounded concept, something that engages all these various different factors. So we can actually come out with a concept that isn't as contested and means a collection of different things, and it's more comprehensive. Okay, can we go to the next slide? Okay, so the origins of hegemony, if we look all the way back to the origins of hegemony, we go back to ancient Greece, the so-called birthplace of civilization, or at least the birthplace of some forms of civilization. But that's where the concept initially comes from. So in ancient Greece, you had a series of, as we see here, city-states. So as we can see the map of Greece and Turkey, well, part of Persia, there's lots of yellow states, 11 islands dotted around, and each of them are a separate state. If we take the red ones, they were the big ones. These were big provinces within Greece. So this all happened 3,000 years ago. And what were the basis of the Greek system was that all these little parts basically enrolled into one. There was no formal governance within Greece. Instead, there were these little states, these little city-states. And that can really shows us how the international system works. Obviously, within international relations, there's no hierarchy. There's an anarchy which exists. It's made up of 190 or little entities map, and no one seems to rule them. This is the same in ancient Greek. So what this guy called Euthydemus, who was a well-known historian at the time, he was writing about war in 100 years or so before he was born, and he was born in sort of 200 BC, so before Christ, so a long time ago. And what he did was he wrote a history on what he called the Peloponnesian War. Now, Peloponnese is the tiny little bit of which is sort of the red bit really there. And what happened in the Peloponnesian Wars, and there were many of them, was that certain states took it in turns to like rule. One state ruled, then it fell because it was beaten up, basically. And then another state rose up and that fell. And during this period, certain states led the system better than others. Certain city-states led the system. So what Euthydemus did was he compared what he called hegemony, which is leadership, to something called archal, which is brutality. And he was comparing Athens, so the city of Athens. When Athens governed Greece, they did it in a way which was quite nice. It was the leader, but it created stability. Tried to create law. It tried to create peace to a certain degree. Yes, it was the dominant state, and it was at the top of the hierarchical tree, but it wasn't nasty or brutal. When Athens fell, it was replaced by Sparta, and Sparta was far more brutal. It decided to go into various states and kill people and basically sort and basically put them under slavery. And this was seen as no one liked that very much. It wasn't really seen as pleasant. So hegemony is a leadership which isn't brutal, really, to a certain degree. That's where it comes from. Which looks to lead and to create stability rather than just brutally do things. So when we talk about hegemony, that's what it should mean. Now, some people conflict that and they hegemony just in terms of power. You move on to the next one. So the historical development of hegemony in the state system, so in international relations, you can see, and I try and look at this in book, periods whereby certain states have led. But I also look at that states necessarily that lead. They often bring in ideas, and important ideas were pervasive. And it's the ideas. This is the question which is whether it's the ideas or the states itself which are hegemonic. So the rise of the state system sought the emergence of all certain forms of capitalism alongside in states. And it was this, if you like, which brought hegemony, stability, etc. Capitalism virtually came at the same time as the nation states, so they're really inseparable. It also then obviously led to colonialism, and then as a result, that widened the concept of the city-state. So when we look at hegemony, the first sort of hegemon that we see on the world is often seen as Spain, with the Spanish Empire, particularly the age of discovery, what they call discovery. In other words, Europeans finding bits of the world where obviously were already discovered by those which lived there. and then colonializing them and stealing their lands, etc., and doing quite unpleasant things, and then bringing this back to Europe. So Spain became this sort of figurehead, if you like, for the first form of colonialism, but they didn't do it in a very, I suppose, tactful way, because it wasn't really. So when the Dutch came along, they to institutionalize institutions more viable. In this part of the world, the so-called spice and East Asia, obviously Indonesia became a significant player within that sort of Dutch system, where it played a significant role within the international system, also to commodities, it became important for the rule to create all the capitalists. The British, in the sense that they brought in a type of free market liberal capitalism for the first time, and they tried to internationalize the world far more sophisticatedly. And so it was here where you had the gold standard and colonial parts of the world, the wider capitalist system. They sort of play a significant role. So we had sort of Spanish. By looking at this, you could sample this hegemony and sort of liberal 19th century liberalism, the ideas behind it. Can you move to the next slide? Thank you. Cheers, that's great. Now, within international relations, there's a sub-discipline called international political. And in international political economy, hegemony has always been a part. International political economy has only really featured since the 1970s. Hegemony was a term which was being utilized and used, as I've explained here, in used in different form. But in Ireland, they decided to use it more concretely, more systematically. And this was because from 1944 to 1961, the world was by something called the dollar system, whereby, if you like, ruled. Whereby in 19 put in economic system was put in place. So after the war, every currency would be by what the dollar was doing. The dollar was the kingmaker. The dollar was everything. Now this obviously brought in the import of the US, and it brought in the first sort of bastion of US hegemony. This is where we first see it. Within international political economy, some of the people were right in sort of sense, because they equated hegemony entirely with the dollar, and they said, well, this is the US role in the world, if you like, or leading the world through the dollar, through the behavior of the dollar. If the dollar falls, then the US will stop being hegemonic. And so they equated this with the idea that as soon as the dollar and couldn't time so the dollar of the convertibility to gold, lots of people thought we're going to enter a new era. And at the time, we're talking about maybe the Chinese would lead economically. Sorry, not the Chinese, the Japanese at the time, the 80s, would lead economically. Well, obviously that never happened. But what it did, the fall of the dollar provided a new debate in hegemony. And these 20 years, well, 20 years, 15 years, a lot of people within the school of hegemonic stability theory were discussing what would happen next. Now, hegemonic stability theory is this idea that if economic, and it's mainly an economic process, an economic power that is strong and it's dominant and it's going to stabilize the system. Once you lack that hegemonic power, you have instability. And this is what they were saying at the time, and they will confirm in the end was that the Cold War ended and the US, rather than declining in its influence, seemed a lot stronger because politically it's throughout the 90s it became extremely hegemonic and tried to build a whole collection of international institutions. We go on the next slide. Okay, so this brings us to the notion of ideas. And this brings us to the argument that perhaps US hegemony on its own, as we've already shown through the notion of state power and measuring this to see how much power it has, isn't often the best solution. So within international relations, we have a different way, if you like, of understanding hegemony. Well, there is another way of hegemony. And that is, they argue that hegemonic stability theory lacked the understanding of what they call structural power. You have power, you can have power or like hegemonic power, and that can be shown through figures and through GDP and through how much money you have, how much army you have. But structural power is probably more important. That is by international law, which we formulate through the UN, was certainly placed forward through the US state initially, but it became far more structural. What you then saw in the 1980s and 1990s was a reconfiguration, and you saw the influence of what was known later on as neo-Gramscians, those who follow the understanding of theorist called Andrew. Now, him, called Robert Cox, who died recently, who came out with the notion of orders. In history, periods where we have orders, and throughout these orders are governed by certain for historical institutions, but they are led by a specific state, and it's the specific state. The idea that it's the specific state that was dominant and hegemonic, and its type and the current world order that we look for in a particular era, which gives us understanding of hegemony itself. The other thing, and another argument here, is that there is the notion here of class. Class is often initially downplayed, or was firstly downplayed by hegemony, because we looked at sort of strong states. But how are these formalized? And they're formalized by certain classes, and certain classes and interests amongst themselves. So certain states have dominant classes which relationship with other dominant classes in other states. And it's these states combined that come out, or these sort of classes that combine, that come out with certain ideas. And it's these we should be. Okay. And this brings us to the concept of liberalism and the notion of neoliberalism. Now, for those who don't know what the term is, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with the term neoliberalism, but neoliberalism is not a key word, if you like, it has been the key word. It's an idea of a particular form of deregulated capitalism, whereby the state allows for market forces to produce and stimulate economic growth. And by doing so, the state often stays back. It's the job of the state, therefore, to try and attract investment and attract business investment rather than state mobilizing power itself. It's not the job of the state, but to create economic wealth. It's the job of the market to create economic wealth. And this is really sort of hegemonic idea at time. Everything like globalization comes down to the notion of neoliberalism, the importance of the private sector as a factor, and this is globalized with things like the debt crisis and the way the World Bank solved, if you like, look to address the debt problem by opening up states and opening up state economies to private competition. So this idea, very fundamentals of ideas after 1989. In the Cold War, you had two systems, obviously capitalism, which was a lot more state orientated, versus communism. Communism is defeated, and so you now, and capitalism didn't have to be restrained as such. And as the market grew, due to the end of the communist alternative, the notion of neoliberalism and the notion of free market capitalism grew across the world, to the extent that all states engage with it in some form and play this sort of game of being a competition state. So it's this, if you like, according to, I say, Gramsci, and we'll come back to him in a minute, readings that have increased the interest in what they call neoliberal hegemony. What's a neoliberal ideology? What's hegemonic here is this idea. It's not necessarily the fact that it's the US state which is behind the world order, it's the concept of neoliberalism. So here the role of the US state becomes unclear. If neoliberalism becomes such a it's a doctrine, and all other states engage with it. Say China does it better than the US, other parts of the world does it better than the US. Singapore, for example, it's the notion of the market is such that businesses which are to the US start leading, and if it isn't too keen on this idea because it wants to roll the US back in, so the neoliberal idea is no longer associated with the US where it stemmed from. Okay, can we? Okay, this brings us to Gramsci himself, and I'll be as sort of straightforward as possible here, right, without trying to complicate everyone and make it boring. So Gramsci was an Italian who was writing in the 1920s. He was imprisoned by the fascist dictatorship at the time, Mussolini, for being a communist, and spent 20 years in prison, or was sentenced to 20 years in prison, where he wrote a lot of his ideas while he was in prison. And what he did at the time is he came out with this thing called, he came out with his understanding of hegemony. And what he looked at things was he looked at classes. So he looked at how in Italy, in particular, you had the growth of the Italian state was merged because of how the northern parts of Italy created and established whereby certain classes gained the upper hand to ideas and others. And this is important when we look at all forms of post-colonial states. How does the colonial state emerge as a post-colonial state? How does it put forward this idea? Well, from this organization of one dominant class eating and getting in the consent from subaltern classes. And it's here, this sort of mixture of the sort of ideas and how the peasants and peasantry buy into this idea that you see. This is what Gramsci was really arguing. And he was using, then he was criticizing Lenin and the way Lenin was trying to do this. So criticizing Croce, a guy in Italy, but both of them use this term. And what he sort of suggested was within society, we have what's called wars of things. We don't necessarily have a war. Revolutions and changes in government, real changes don't come through power, through military. They come from a change of ideas. And this is what he called the war of position. It's when things change, ideas change in civil society. And it's when public, the classes, the southern classes, no longer buy in the dominant ideas. And what happens as a result is either the dominant classes have to respond to this and say, well, we'll do X, Y, and Z to make you feel a bit better, or we'll engage with you more, or the whole thing is transformed to something else. So Gramsci talked about this. This is how he understood hegemony. And what he talked about was that hegemony was the sum of ideology, ideas, but also something called common sense. So common sense, all about common sense, but that is something within society which goes beyond ideology, when it just becomes normal, it becomes natural. We do this. We get up in the morning, we go do X, we go to the shop, use our phones with X, Y. Well, what you're doing here is quite engaging with certain years of neoliberal capitalism. By just engaging with your phone, you're coming at all sort of politics and eat it through the through manufacture, through the preservation of the food chain and production and things like that. So this is what he was referring to. So that becomes far more nuanced, far more complex. Anything to states and things like that. Yeah, just so this brings us, if you like, questions about the current system and the current way we should look at things. The notion that on one level you have powers, power, and on the other level you have dominant ideas. One of the questions that a lot of, I suppose, journalists, briefly all the time, you like, is whether or not there's this sort of battle between the US and China, whether hegemon, this new hegemonic power. So use some sort of the same sort of language was for example, one of the things that they like to suggest here is that China has a different way of doing things, and it has a different way of understanding the world and a different way of ordering the world. But some don't actually look at it like that. Some just say, well, China is there to replace, if you like, the US. However, if we look at things in terms of ideas have they got? Well, the only thing we have got is that the US proposed something called the Washington Consensus in the early 90s, which became the main breeding ground, if you like, for neoliberalism, the US has dominance, complete dominance over the World Bank, IMF, because it pays into the system, so it has the rights for those institutions, and as a result, the US can manage to make something called the Washington Consensus, which was a prescription for neoliberal politics for the developing world and for countries which were struggling with debt repayments. Basically, that the state should sell off its assets and the private sector would come in. Now, China done this differently. They come out with something called the Beijing Consensus, which has said, we will give you all this money and we will provide you with these loans, and you won't have to pay back, providing that we can come in and basically parts of your country. Now, basically, senders need that for their own resources. So there's question marks if this is a new form of imperialism. Well, China, no, it's not, because China sort of puts itself down as very much being the leader of the South. So for the Chinese aren't trying to lead something at all. They're not trying to contest the US. They're not trying to do anything like this. They fully explain they are a tool within global capitalism, and they need them, and they require what goes on in the dominant markets in Europe as much as anything else. So they're not leading us. They are moving in ways which are becoming quite dominant. These practices are still the same practices which were carried out previously. So they've all been sort of consumed within the wider global economy. So when people talk about the Chinese contesting the US, we're questioning that a little bit, and we have to come at the end of the day. Well, I actually question it, right? Questioning it, and if we actually look at the Chinese state, there's a number of things. It does have personal people, etc., but it doesn't have anywhere near the sort of capacity and mobilization Western states might have in terms of its manufacturing role, which doesn't see it's leading in any way, it's providing a market service. And it's also still very much adhering to money coming from classes, businesses, etc., from the dominant Europe, etc. Okay, so we move on to the next one. So that brings us to the question which more and more significant here, the notion of possibly regional hegemonies. So will we get to a situation with that sort of hegemony at all? Can we get to a situation where we don't have a leader necessarily? Now, generally speaking, those here coincided with chaos, so they say. When one era is declining, or one particular hegemonic order is declining, and another one is yet to emerge. It's a bit like I mentioned about crisis. Well, you can argue that that's currently the era that we're living in. However, the way we operate, the system we operate, the way we work, the sort of neoliberal consumer society that we live in is hardly being necessarily attacked. We still all engage with this. So we could have something which is another idea called the notion of regional hegemony. Now, this picture here is from the dystopian fiction 1984 by George Orwell, where he foresaw a world in three different worlds, which all fought each other time and time again. And the disputed region was the places where you can see in Fiji within that, were the places where all big wars happened because they changed. And this was obviously a fiction at the time. But if we actually look at regional hegemonies, we could look at regional bodies and regional setups. So the European Union, significant notion of regionalism, and obviously in this part of the world, ASEAN. Now you can look at ASEAN and you can say, well, that's not really mobilized in the way that the European Union does because states still like their own thing. But nevertheless, you can see it has the potential to do that. And certain regions across the world, we don't actually need these institutions. It could just be significant forms of roots. And so the argument within each different region, I mean, India's biggest in Asia, you can suggest, well, is that going to lead Asia? Going to play China? Region. How's that gonna? Is that region with South Africa and Nigeria in so is that sort of some so I'm looking far more forms of hegemony rather than global. Is it that which we should be looking at increasingly? Is that where we should move the notion and understand the notion of hegemony increasingly? Having said all of that, we have sort of new regional powers and blocks, if you like, that are added to the contested way to understand hegemony. Because all these various things, if we look at all these regional blocks, what are they actually trying to do in terms of ideas? If, say, Asia's been, led or run primarily stabilized, if you like, by China or potentially subly this part of the world, possibly Indonesia eventually. What are they? They're actually trying to come out with ideas, just manage the same idea. So is hegemony not changing? We still just facilitate management of the neoliberal system. As I explained yesterday, the neoliberal system itself is in great crisis. So this sort of changes the understanding of how we work things out. And with the new forms of geopolitics which are going on, particularly in things like the Middle East, does this plow into things even more and make things even more complex and complicated? So hegemons, now that's a hegemon refers to a country which is hegemonic. Regional blocks and their relationship to world order very much provides new avenues for the term. And what this does do in opportunity is make the term hegemony even more confusing. Because if we already don't know whether you're talking about a state or a dominant ideology, then if we go through all these little these little regions and say Chinese hegemony, Brazilian hegemony, South African hegemony, Nigerian hegemony, Iranian hegemony, Saudi Arabian hegemony, are we just confusing things even more? And that becomes another question. Yeah. Sorry about this. Okay, I'll make this as quickly as possible because we're now going into the realms of theory, which will confuse things, and we're now going into different subjects. But there is also a conversation post-hegemony. Maybe we should take hegemony. Maybe the problem is with hegemony ourselves. If we actually think of an era where the problem is dominant ideas, and if we look to democratize the world, we should keep on democratizing ideas. And this is particularly important in, let's say, post-colonial world with social movements, post-colonial movements, where we have this notion that, in fact, if you contest and if you compete and if you don't comply with these ideas and you come out with your own ideas, this is one way of dealing like with the system. Not a very easy way of dealing with creating a state, it allows certain aspects of ideas to be diffused. So one of the arguments here is possibly we shouldn't look at these dominant ideas. If we want to actually contain and democratize ideas, we should just look to contest them in various settings and at various things. This sort of follows an attack, if you like, on the state itself that autonomous Marxists and postmodernists often talk about when they say that they want democracy in the world. You should sort of attack the dominant ideas that are always put forward by a state, because by doing that, then you, if you like, gain self sort of fulfillment. And so this sort of suggests that we should be looking and moving towards a world where we try to move beyond states and we move towards societies far more and mobilize from below. And it's there where we can get post-hegemonic from. However, that all seems a bit complex, and at terms that seems a little bit like shooting for the stars. So what have we got left? If you like, we can rethink all of these things, and we can rethink them from a long way off. We can, well, the practice is important. We are talking about hegemony. We need to understand where it's all come from. We need to go through this and try and come out with a more plural account of hegemony is. Something that is reflexive, something that is grand account, but takes the state ideology both seriously. So it takes the notion of a dominant state, but it also takes it of ideology very seriously and looks at both and how they facilitate themselves, but it also brings back debate, like I'm trying to do today, into the over that moving the two. Sorry. And you could also argue in today's world, this sort of thing is very much needed, because we really know what's happening so much in the current era today, because we we still talk about US dominance, and to a certain degree, the US state is still the sort of leader. And what happens in the US and within society, the US is particularly the way it works, the way it switches. However, the US, Germany, a lot of the time, of era is far more cloudier. Same to a certain degree with neoliberal hegemony. All sorts of countries like China will claim, well, they're not being neoliberal. All sorts of countries would claim they're not following this sort of rhetoric. People would argue and say discussions within hegemonic, however, of everyday life were said initially by the US. So the world that we currently live in, it might not be what the founding fathers of the US did the world to look like, but the initial ideas can stem and can be understood from the attraction, if you like, of the post-Second World War era and the so-called winning of the Cold War. So that should also, we shouldn't just discount the US. So it should still appear as important. But we should look at things like new developments of regional powers and how that affects things alongside particular classes, which you can argue is still the most persuasive, because it's classes which still mobilize these ideas and practices. Okay, just what's the next one? I don't think there's many left. Not quite sure. No, there is, but is that it? No, is that it? Oh, there's
That's
not.
the last one.
All right, that's it. Okay, so I thought there was another slide. Okay, so that is why to finish off why the concept of hegemony, I thought I had a conclusion there, is still very important. But it should be used in a manner that takes into all these things into account rather than use in which it used to and it continues to be today as something which is a term which sort of means everything for everyone's fit. Just to finish up, one of the arguments I've seen, which is even more strange, but it ties into this notion of regionalism. Recently was in the Foreign Affairs magazine, which talked about how the EU should actually take over the US as the new so-called hegemon. But that sort of shows everything what's bad, if you like, about how the term's used, because the EU itself is a collection of states, it's a region, so it's going to have countries within it making certain ideas. It also generally comes out with the same sort of principles, slightly different from neoliberal hegemony, and will also play off with other forms of region. So I'm not quite sure how that could formulate necessarily how that could be necessarily a hegemonic state in that respect, because it's not a state, but it does sort of play out to some of the arguments which are used. It's also deeply unpopular at the moment. So that brings us, if you like, to the end of what I'm trying to say here today. So, okay, thank you.
We got lots of terms of okay, we do correspond to why yeah, because I think it but the debate of the mind game on the country and this participation and Indonesia season karena kita punya I think how to be able submission and stay your name okay, mungkin bisa pakai ini tuh Pak yang
lama jadi ada expirednya.
stay your name
Sorry, which president?
Prabowo, current president of Indonesia.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah.
Say that. Yeah. But
That's a good question.
is it a one by one or you will explain
No.
in the question?
No, we'll
Only the question.
things.
Okay. Please. Could you please remove sorry, Dago. Could you please remove your mask, please? Yeah. It's not clearly here. It's a public administration student.
Okay. Mhm.
You got education?
Yeah, what role does it play in global economy, imperialism, and the other one is
The society and the economy and the relationship. Yeah,
something on imperialism. What's the second one?
but the society.
Society.
Yeah.
Oh, right, yeah. Hegemony society. Yeah.
And the first one is Mustafa. Siapa namanya tadi? Dava. Sorry. Sorry. Okay. Vision. Oke, silakan. Ya, boleh. Kamu boleh. Silakan maju di depan. Siapa namanya? Namanya siapa? Erlin. Okay. It is similar with the first question about how the elected president in the USA they have between USA and China. And maybe this is which one the effect in Indonesia.
Yeah.
Hegemony.
Yeah, which one? Yeah. Yeah.
I think similar for the first and
Yes.
okay, thank you. There are three questions from Dova, Devo, and Erlina. And I think the presentation was all to answer the question, please.
Yeah. In question to the first question about the proud boa. Is proud boa?
Proud boa, yeah.
Proud. My pronunciation's terrible. So yeah. Yeah, he's an interesting character. He's an interesting guy. I'm not really quite sure what to make of him at the moment. I'll be interested to hear what you say and what obviously everyone thinks. In terms of what he will do, I mean, he appears obviously from quite being back and tradition, yet he's obviously, wrapped himself around and interest, and that, if you like, is a sort of classic trait of being of yeah, absolutely, creating a sort of trying to create a, if you like, a community. In terms of international, this goes out to the third question as well. Where Indonesia plays itself. Again, it's quite interesting. Easier in the book here, in the included in belief, serve it, which in writing, there's a number of what in power, and in it was obviously included that sort of power, I feel like. China, South Africa, and Saudi Arabia. I think there is, yes, is there, you can't hear.
This is
Right, okay. Is that there? Yeah. Sorry. So it's interesting, I suppose, Indonesia, where it's going to place itself in the next 20 years. It certainly appears at the moment that he's not looking to lead, in the sense he doesn't want Indonesia to lead as a sort of ideas-based country, and it looks like it's going to sort of try and he wants a sort of system which plays off, if you like, between, I suppose, Chinese and American sort of forms of, if you like, hegemony, and play off around that rather than necessarily leading something itself. But it's very difficult to actually know. But I think Indonesia is quite interesting in that sense, because it's something that can sort of come out with different ideas. It's just how they're articulated and where and at what levels. But it's part of, if you like, of what's understood as the semi-peripheral states, which include Indonesia in, which are often the most interesting to study because they're big enough to make a difference and are big enough to create sort of instabilities and things like that. But they're also big enough to be quite large partners, and quite large sort of backers of ideas. So that's that's where I'd really position Indonesia. So I think that answers the first and the last question. On the second question, so your hegemony, and so you got imperialism, and obviously how hegemony affects, or how it can be utilized to affect ideas. Yeah, I mean, one of the big sort of factors, if you like, in understanding sort of Gramsci's notion of the subaltern and the dominant classes is precisely the way that social ideas are perpetrated through hegemony, how the sort of the ruling classes, if you like, perpetrate certain ideas, and then the lower peasantry or working classes buy into these and support them, and you have a sort of some sort of passive relationship between the two, and it's these where ideas and consent are formalized and formulated, and that's certainly seen within societal hegemony, and that operates at all different levels. Imperialism, so that's an interesting one for different reasons. So if you actually look at the era of imperialism, the original era of imperialism, and people get confused a little bit about colonialism versus imperialism, because colonialism obviously occurred much in and it's different types of colonialism, settler colonialism. But it was a distinct type of was a distinct historical era where, if you like, British dominance was fading. It was caught up the Europeans. So they went these different European states, in particular Germany and France, suddenly emerged as contenders and players. So the sort of contestation, if the waning of these hegemonic ideas, they all went charging into all these states went charging into Africa and Asia, and took what they could in brutal forms. So that's not obviously hegemonic in for those individuals who had their land taken and things like that. Sort of forms of obviously brutality. So we have to make distinction between the two. What happened afterwards of imperialism, a form of hegemony, because after imperialism, after these lands have been taken, you then have this sort of rule of developing these countries through colonial administration and various things like that. And that much the sort of difference between, as I say, very similar to what Thucydides talked about, where he said, well, should you lead a country through war, or should you not through war, through rule and law and ideas and institutions, or should you be more brutal and authoritarian to that country? And obviously the former one works better hegemonically, but that's imperialism of the past. In terms of modern day imperialism, there's a very good book, which you probably should try and have a look at, which is written by David Harvey, who's quite a well-known writer on imperialism. He's quite an old guy now. I think he's in his 90s, but he's still writing profusely, and he's one of the sort of big names. And he wrote a book in 2004 called The New Imperialism, and in that he was talking about the Gulf War in particular, and looking at how this became, as imperialism became as a sort of tool to a certain degree of US rule, but it became similar to that which we saw in the end of the 19th century, in the sense that the occupation, say, of Iraq at the time was obviously imperialist, and it was geared around to imperialize markets and things like that for different powers. But this again was not going to create hegemony, it was going to create unrest. So the sort of building of societies come afterwards. But it does follow this sort of trait within understanding, certainly forms of passive understandings of hegemony, that they often, the hegemonic relationship often comes from something that is more brutal at first, based around occupation. So that's how it sort of fits in with imperialism, and how you could utilize it in terms of imperialism. But one of the questions is a very interesting point, because I didn't mention imperialism in this presentation. I have done in others, but it is quite essential, because it's one of the things that some commentators, when they talk about US hegemony, don't actually talk about, and that is needed. So that is an important factor.
Ada yang pernah lihat film Sparta ya? Ada. Tadi disebut berapa? Itu tentang apa? Itu dari Sparta. Familiar with the band Sparta in film?
Yeah.
Yes, I guess they know because the millennial.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Professor Lauren. The next is the Q&A. Does anyone have a question? For the second season? Mr. SLM? Bisa dengan bahasa Indonesia? Oh, the last question isn't answered. The last question from the chat.
Was
Is it about the which one? Society.
oh,
okay.
technology.
Technology, yeah.
Technology. All right, sorry, I didn't. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, it's very big, very sig. Sorry, yeah. So global technology. I would say that's possibly technological innovation is possibly one of the most significant forms of articulations of the idea, the hegemonic idea, the neoliberal or neoliberal society, because it sort of breaks down borders. It does all sorts of various, even by accessing constantly technology, we are upholding the sort of practices, the hegemonic practices of global capitalism. So it is one of these strange things, actually, that if all these other ideas of the ideas are contested and the mechanisms of the state and the dominant practices are contested, we still have these sort of common practices that go on. So I mean, those sort of forms of common sense, I think that's the word we use, are very important. And something which is often, again, not looked at, the importance of how technology has worked and been forged.
Okay, thank you, Professor Lauren. For the second season, please. Someone else? Question, comment, response, for the discussion? Or you from the lecture? Could you hear me? Okay.
Oh, thank you.
And
Yeah, of course.
just what is the why you choose the monster suit?
Why?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In your
Yeah. Yeah.
college.
Yeah. So
Is that a personal reason?
so do you want me to stop?
Yeah.
So the question is asked almost sentence. So for me, when I started international politics, and when I started studying it long ago,
Yeah.
I can't remember where we are now, 20 years. I was always interested in the power, how and why things work, and for what purpose, and for whose purpose. I was always interested, I suppose, from personal reasons as well as everything else. It's sort of the way I sort of things, and was very interested in injustices and things like that. And I think I saw so many prevalent ideas where I mean I grew up in the United Kingdom, not in Ireland, but I grew up in a part of the United Kingdom which is called Wales. It's a country which is a very strange place in the sense it has its own traditions and language and things like that. Yeah, it's predominantly, ruled, if you like, by another country. And I think that how and why people accept some of these things became very important to me, and how things, work like that. The other thing, I think I wasn't satisfied really with some of the definitions given, particularly in terms of US dominance. I just wasn't satisfied with the answers I was getting. And I was just very interested with the power of ideas, how ideas work materially, not just how they work sort of off the top how they've been forged through sort of class dynamics and through linkages through society over time. So it's these are the reasons why I, became very interested in the term hegemony. And the more I read into hegemony, the more I thought this is a very nuanced term. It's been used. It started off, as I say, Thucydides on one level, but then it was used in the Second International by discussions between originally Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg. So it was discussed as a sort of socialist concept, how to create a state after capitalism. And then the British took an interest in it. Bizarrely, they took an interest in their sort of empire building by listening to what was going on in these things and saw it as a way how they can prevail this sort of understanding of creating a society by their own terms. So it's always been a very persuasive term.
Yeah.
And I think the reason I still think it's the term which can explain more than anything else the way the world ticks and the way the world can be ordered.
Yeah. Okay. Please follow this one.
Oh, right. Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah. Great.
Yeah, true.
So, one thing, one way of nice and so,
Yeah.
but all power, it's phenomenon or this one.
Is there any question for this? No. If I have one question, I have another question in my market.
Okay. Go on.
My wish is the young people. Because I think a lot of audience here is young people. It's young people take part in the counter of the economy.
Sorry.
How is the young people will take part in the counter of the hegemony?
Counter-hegemony.
Counter. Counter.
How can they? How
Maybe-
can they?
Maybe from digital technology,
Yeah.
algorithm, they have a
Yeah, no, they can.
significant role for
Well, they can. Yeah, they just they can.
why?
We can,
We can answer for them.
yeah, I mean, counter-hegemony is something else. Yeah, I mean, they can.
Pertanyaan saya sebenarnya
Engage.
tentang bagaimana
Engage.
kemudian bisa mengambil berpartisipasi dalam politik. Ya, mungkin teman-teman juga sana ya. Tapi saya ingin tahu bahwa hidupnya peran sebagai jaminan. Kali hidupnya peran untuk menyadarkan demokrasi itu sebenarnya nggak mungkin. Karena tadi kan
So, I mean, counter-hegemony is another concept, technically.
Okay.
So, I mean, there's no actual mention of counter-hegemony in Gramsci or in just about any original forms of understanding. Counter-hegemony only comes into a lot of some of the post-colonial writings. It's not really adopted. A lot of them, so early 20th century people were interested in counter-hegemony. They wanted to create a hegemony. They wanted to create, a socialist, an alternative hegemony, an alternative world. But counter-hegemony is quite important. You're looking at things like post-hegemony because it's contesting ideas. And so in terms of, young people obviously contest ideas through creating different, and they become a significant thing here through different forums. And also not just contest them, but also sustain them. They can articulate them in different ways. They can, that's why technology is very important here, because it does two things. On one level, it facilitates hegemony. I just said it's a very important factor of everyday life. The material production of technology serves the interests, obviously, of those who run technological companies. So they're getting lots of money, and by doing that, the global practices, the hegemonic practices, if you like, that keep them up, work well for them. But a lot of the times they create forms of resistance. They create bodies, various forms of opposition, which disagree with all these practices, and these create different discourses. And so this becomes another interesting factor here when we talk about hegemony, because we suddenly have all sorts of different ideas and sorts of different things where we have lots of opposition. And what's occurred through the crisis, and more as we go on, is that we have lots and several forms of opposition, but we don't really have much solution to work out how we can actually change things. But there's lots of ways of contesting things. So it's become an important factor in that sense.
Yeah. Do the question from
The
see answer?
The Ukraine.
Yeah.
I think the Ukraine crisis very much follows what's happening with regional hegemonies again. I think.
Bisa didengar ya suaranya?
Yeah. So I think that's what you see with Ukraine. It's another reason why we should look at the sort of battles, wars within regions, and look at why you now have states adopting a sort of dominant place within these regions, and try and look at the consequences of that.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think Russia wants to create a new system. It just wants to create its own regional bloc and regional dominance. So that in itself is obviously negative for people in Ukraine for obvious reasons, and that same, I suppose, we can see in forms of other conflicts across certain regions across the world. Yeah. So,
Okay. Okay,
I suppose.
Okay.
That's right. And what's the second for that? Yeah, yeah, no, I got one. Yeah, if there is any. It's so Israel, yeah, it does. Sorry, it does, but I answered this question sort of in a way yesterday. So it does, but not in ways you think, in a strange fashion. Um, there's film stars in the US at the moment. Now, this might sound ridiculous, but there's film stars in the US who are splitting themselves up into Team Israel and Team Palestine. Certain film stars who like, it's almost like picking a soccer team or something. Certain film stars are supporting Israel and certain film stars are supporting Palestine. So Israel Palestine's obviously a serious problem, and it's a serious source of instability. It's a serious source of um, uh, depends. It depends what you think of it, but unethical, inhumane occupation. Yeah, from one. From yeah. So that's one thing, and the question marks over whether it's humanitarian crisis or this, of which it is, whether it's genocide or various other things. And I think, but these things are very contested between the two. So what it plays a role in terms of hegemony, is that it's been phased out in what's often seen as the culture wars. In other words, one group arguing for one side, the other group arguing for the other side, and this has become global. The fact that you've got camps in the US camping out for Palestine, and then you've got people with Israeli flags breaking these camps. The fact this is also occurring in London, it has been occurring in London for a lot of time, for quite a long time. And it's also occurring in various parts of Europe, particularly, as I say, the younger generation, which are overwhelmingly supporting Palestine over this, is one of these sort of arguments. So you've got two different ideas, two different sides, and two different disputes. So in terms of hegemony, you've got two different, if you like, hegemonic discourses which are clashing over what happens, and it certainly has a global effect, a significant global effect, and it's creating divisions. And in certain countries, they called it wrong. So a number of countries, particularly in Europe, has come out. It's pretty much on Israel's side in different ways, but they have done. And for example, in the House of Commons in Westminster, you've got the Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister. He keeps referring to the aggressors being Hamas constantly. Keeps referring to the opposition party and old links with us, as if they're these sort of evil people with the brave Israeli defenders, when they're shooting themselves in the foot, because in general, poll after poll after poll has showed that in civil society, particularly anyone under the age of 30, there's much more support, much more sympathy for where I live in Ireland. It's almost there's a very tiny minority which are pro-Israel. It's a big pro-Palestinian country, island, possibly because of its colonial past. Well, it is because of its colonial past. So it's an interesting conflict, because the rhetoric and the ideas are two competing ideas which are fighting for hegemony here, and they're fighting for for different, they're fighting, if you like, for a war of position with different types of ideas, and it's because it's gone global. It's more interesting than anything else. So in that sense, that's how we can see it in terms of hegemony, definitely. Sorry? US. Sorry, UN Security Council. So I'm talking about discourses and ideas and things like that. They're pretty much stalemate. They're pretty much stalemate over that. I can't see. I mean, the UN. I mean, that's a different question. That's not really to do with hegemony here. I suppose the only difference you see is that the US realize they can't silence Palestine on this. They can't. They realize the world's not going to just accept this. So the US have also got a strong Israeli influential society within the US, which obviously funds various parties and does various things like that. So they're not going to they're in a difficult situation in the sense they're not going to, they've consistently, gone against Israel, gone against Palestine, abstained against various. Now they're sort of bluntly sort of allowing for certain mandates, but I don't think there's going to be anything significant which erodes Israeli power. I think they'll do it in a little bit by bit. So yeah, so that's why I don't really see that being significant hegemony. Only to the point that the US can't, maybe doesn't have the power it used to have in aspects.
Really?
Maybe, I don't know. Maybe, yeah.
Is it because of the political and economical issues from the?
I just think it's becoming more redundant because it's I mean, I'm not really quite sure what it serves in Israel. It also again within the US you've got splits completely within US civil society. So
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately they're democracies, so which way they're going to turn. So it's more of a domestic problem. It sort of just so shows the problem with.
Okay, is it enough? Okay. Thank you, Professor, for the I'm so happy to sharing your knowledge and strengthening. Before closing, let me briefly summarize the main point we Professor explained to us what the concept of hegemony from Christie and neo-Christian perspective, and the key concept and physical habits, and he also spoke us how hegemony works for ancient culture and family life, experiencing hegemony from liberal perspective of everybody, and explore several of the legacy. I think saya kira tadi banyak sekali yang sudah kita dapat dari apa yang dijelaskan oleh Profesor Paul. Jadi teman-teman mungkin yang tidak belajar soal politik atau international politik, saya kira bisa menangkap soal bagaimana hegemoni ini berlaku sampai sekarang. Teman-teman pernah mendengar soal IMF. Itu adalah salah satu contoh bagaimana negara-negara superpower itu bisa melakukan hegemoni lewat pemberian kita. Indonesia adalah salah satu kliennya. Jadi kita bisa merasakan bagaimana kemudian kalian sampai the next generation itu akan menanggung hutang-hutang yang sudah dilakukan oleh pemerintah kita lewat IMF. Jadi teman-teman bisa melihat pola itu. Transnational economy dan global community itu adalah salah satu dari bagaimana ekonomi terjadi di saat ini. Dan tadi dimulai beberapa kita soal isu yang sangat terbaru ya. soal rank, kemudian gabung soal barisan Israel, kemudian Prof. Wawan menjelaskan ya bahwa tidak mungkin untuk saat ini Amerika menjadi power karena kekuatan society dari masyarakat Amerika sendiri mereka sangat demokratis, jadi banyak penolakan kalau kita lihat di berita-berita ya, banyak penolakan yang kemudian dilakukan oleh masyarakat Amerika sendiri dan kemungkinan itu akan menjadi problem untuk Indonesia politik. Ini yang penjelasan dari terakhir saya. Nah, okay, I would like to thank you for Professor on the today's session and also terima kasih pada teman-teman sudah hadir hari ini dan give applause for us today. Dan saya kira teman-teman bisa merasakan sekali bagaimana this dan thank you very much and have a great day. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Oh ya, foto di sana, di situ. Nggak tahu. Atau kita dari situ motonya dari atas. Nah, take your photo session. Bisa berdiri ya teman-teman untuk foto session dulu. Teman-teman mau diambil foto, bisa kemudian berdiri dulu, kita akan diskusi. Ya, teman-teman bisa stand up di kursi masing-masing, berdiri di kursi masing-masing, kita ambil.
Oh yeah, no, thank you for your question.
Ibu bisa merapat ke tengah. Monggo silakan. Bentar Ibu, saya cek dulu. Bisa Ibu. Oke, 3, 2, 1. 3, 2, 1. Sebentar. 3, 2, 1. 3, 2, 1. Last one. 3, 2, 1. Oke. Ibu mungkin bisa foto berempat dulu gitu. Silakan di sini aja. Tidak apa-apa biar saya fotokan. Oh gini boleh. Kamu tidak bingung. Kalau kayak gitu ya, belanja itu di pinjol mau pakai
Ya, saya mau.
Bisa atau international business internship share orang. Asli.
Kita
Nah, di sini
kan sih.
ya. Tadi kan dari mana ya?
Untuk sangganya nggak berdiri sih masih bilang lagi kita main dulu.
Belum. Bagi-bagi tanya lagi. Go.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Thank you.
I know how before.
Okay.
It's still myself.
All right, okay.
That's what I do. Yes, with it.
All right, okay, yeah.
Dari ini.
Okay.
So, boleh. Mau ikut lagi? Boleh. Iya.
Mas Fandi.
Siang mungkin cuma beberapa pakai makan siang yang awal saya refer sama sisa bentuk. Oh, biasanya dia kalau kan malam dan di mobil atau kalau mau yang malam saya dan
Bisa.
cuma masalahnya saya pesannya mobilnya pakai Fortuner Director jadi buatnya jumlahnya cuma 5. Dari sini ya nanti jam 1 itu rapat dengan foto di pendek kan di kalau itu di mobil tadi mungkin
Nanti kita lagi pesan.
Nanti sini lagi mas.